I'm
Yeah.
excited to be here today. This is really a special interview. We're going to get a chance to explore kind of a rich tapestry of two distinct and I think intertwined cultures. We're going to dive into the world of African American and Jewish folklore, storytelling, myths, and we have two great guests with us today to help us unearth some of the hidden gems and to try to build some excitement around the power of storytelling and the messages that they convey over time. Are you excited?
Yes, we're going to have tremendous fun, really. And there's so much to talk about. So do you have some questions, Eric? You want to start or should I start?
I do. I'm gonna jump right in if folks don't mind. And Langston and Adam, it's great to be here today. I have been kind of reading joyfully in preparation, everything from the story of the clever rabbit, rare rabbit, to the wise old tortoise, right? The wise turtle. Things in African American folklore, Brer Rabbit is known for cleverness and his ability to outsmart his adversary, often using wit to triumph over larger and stronger opponents. Within Jewish folklore, these series of stories I've come across about a wise turtle who uses wisdom and cleverness to navigate challenging situations and outwit those who underestimate him. And as I was looking at these stories, you both write, you both are collect stories new and old. Adam, you have a phenomenal new book out. I hope everyone here has a copy or will have a copy by the end of tomorrow, called the Golem of Brooklyn, which is this powerful story that I hope we get to talk about as well. But my first question is, tell us from your perspectives within hip hop, within street stories. What is the power of stories and fables and myths, and what are some of your favorites?
I can jump in if you want. Oh man, the power of story. There's so many different ways I can go with that. But I think it actually all relates back to, yeah, the word power, right? So, at least in the African American tradition, as you kind of mentioned, all of these stories, and most of them feature these characters, right, that either seize or assert power through their wits or their kind of physical prowess, right? And so if you think about the history of Black America, right, it's a history and a community that has faced severe racism, prejudice, and dominance, and maybe even beyond that, like just attempts to control our lives, right? And so, as you see in these stories, as complicated as some of these are, they're symbolic sources of power for us. They're stories that feature characters that, through their wits of strength, were beyond control, and I think it's about like acting beyond control. And so you can see that through Brer Rabbit, right, which is a complicated story because of various reasons. But as it came over from Africa, as it really took root in America, it's about this smaller animal, right, using its wits and its intelligence and knowledge, right, to get what it wants, right, and to get over on other foes. And if you think about, stereotypes about Black people back then and now, right, in terms of our intelligence and ability to reason, right, the story of this rabbit that whose intelligence was its strength. Yeah, I mean, it's empowering for Black people. And so, yeah, Brer Rabbit is super important. Um, on the other end, I would say something like Shine. Well, Stagger Lee, right, which is part of the tradition of the bad man character, which is a kind of archetype or stock character throughout African American culture. Stagger Lee was a bad man who ruled, with an iron fist and ruled with his physical strength and even violence. And certainly that's complicated, right? But it's a figure who acted outside of control, outside of law, right? And I think, again, considering, Black culture and legal and sublegal attempts to control us and confine us and even kill us, right? People saw power in that character. And I think that's why you continue to see the bad man character exist in hip hop and in comedy and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I can go on and on, but yeah, the power of storytelling is about empowerment.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Stagger Lee?
Oh yeah, Stagger Lee. Yeah, sorry. It's Stagger Lee was a folk tale, right, that emerged maybe early 20th century. I'm not exactly sure where it was collected, but essentially Stagger Lee is a black male character who typically gets into these physical and verbal confrontations with other people, and typically these stories end with Stagger Lee violently winning some sort of conflict, right? But I think Stagger Lee stories were commonly told through this common storytelling form called the toast, which is a form of oral poetry told in very aggressive rhyming form among Black men in street culture typically. And it's sort of kind of a precursor, or it certainly informs the hip hop MC or rhyming tradition. And so, yeah, Stagger Lee was just a big guy who dominated his community, right, and dominated his spaces with his physical prowess.
What era?
Mhm.
What era?
Oh, mostly between early 20th century, and I think it started to wane in the 1970s. I think what's his name? Rudy Ray Moore, Dolomite, who was probably the last Dolomite, the comic figure, was kind of the last popular Stagger Lee storyteller. But again, I think you can see, and we'll talk about this later, the legacy of Stagger Lee in hip hop through a lot of the gangster rap and a lot of even the hip hop that's popular now. And so Stagger Lee is certainly an important folk tale and folk figure.
Well, before we move on, and so much to get to, can you just tell us a little bit about Anansi the spider as well? Because that's another.
Oh yeah, Anansi, part of the large field of animal tales that mostly took root in West Africa prior to the slave trade. Again, I'm not a super expert on Anansi, but what I do know, it's a West African god who took the form of a spider, and Anansi kind of held lots of historical and mystical knowledge within the community, and again, would use its wits and smarts to outsmart foes. It's one of the premier or primary stories that was carried over in the Middle Passage and brought to America, and really helped inspire later animal tales and kind of that whole animal tale tradition. So super, super important to the Black storytelling tradition.
Great.
I love that. And, it makes me think, Adam and Langston, I think of this character, right, Stagger Lee, right, who is much more aggressive than the stories that often kind of arise into popular culture, right? So into popular culture, which tends to be frightened, right, of Black masculinity or the idea of aggressiveness in the Black community, you would get stories instead of like John Henry, where that aggressiveness was used, right, as a sacrifice, right? But as I was reading, Adam, I'm coming to you because in the Golem of Brooklyn, right, typically, right, stories that come out of the Jewish community are not these stories of revenge. You wrote this amazing story. I couldn't put it down, right? I had this flight. I was in Utah. I had this flight at 5 a.m., needed to go to sleep. I think you may have handed me this early advanced unproofed copy. And I went back to my room. I didn't go to dinner. I stayed up all night reading this story about a golem, white nationalist in Kentucky. And it was a story about aggressiveness, right? About showing up and protecting the community, but also like Stagger Lee, nuanced with lots of kind of moral and value-based questions. Tell us about the golem and the aggressiveness of the golem.
It's funny, I had never connected the golem to Stagger Lee until this moment, but not only are they both aggressive figures, but they both talk a lot of while they do their thing as well. So, so in Jewish folklore, a golem is a humanoid creature constructed out of mud or clay of giant dimensions, 9, 10 feet tall, always made by a rabbi or a very learned and scholarly and observant Jewish man, and always brought to life at a time of crisis, of emergency, either to engage in the martial defense of the Jewish people or to engage in some kind of physical labor that has the same effect. He may be fighting off a pogrom, or he may be repairing, a dam, but in either case, the survival of the Jewish population depends on him. He's brought to life through esoteric prayers, rituals, incantations, often involving things like the secret true name of God. The one thing that remains a constant in the folklore is that the last step in animating him involves the Hebrew word for truth, which is either inscribed on his forehead or written on a piece of paper that is inserted into the golem's mouth. And when he comes alive, he sometimes does the bidding of his creator, sometimes refuses to or fails to. There's a lot of Frankenstein's monster that is indebted in some way to the golem. I'm not suggesting Mary Shelley stole the idea, but there's a lot of crossover. When the golem has accomplished his purpose, or when he's failed to do so and needs to be deactivated, the way that it's done is by erasing the aleph from the word truth, which turns it into the word death. And this returns the golem to a state of being inchoate matter. All of these things are a little different in the golem of Brooklyn. To begin with, my golem is not made by a learned or religious or scholarly or rabbinical man. He's brought to life by an art teacher in Brooklyn who is not so much in need of a golem as in possession of a large quantity of clay and extremely stoned. And he brings the golem to life in the absence of any immediate crisis. The golem initially only speaks Yiddish, which his creator, Len Bronstein, does not speak. So initially, he's just brought this creature to life who is cursing at him in a language he doesn't speak and trashing his apartment. Len is able to calm the golem down by putting him in front of a television, playing an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and he runs out to try to find a translator. But eventually what we learn about this golem, first of all, what he's been screaming is mostly, where is the crisis? Because it's unthinkable to him that he would be brought to bear in the absence of a specific task to perform. But the other difference between my golem and the golems of folklore is that my golem is a creature in possession of an ancestral memory. So he has not been created or made as much as remade or recreated. And as such, he's kind of a repository of history and trauma. He remembers every previous iteration of himself dating back to the dawn of time and ancient Egypt and 5th century Babylon. And the adventure essentially begins with this monster who is always set in motion with a purpose, confronting the absence of a purpose. And of course, there's that expression like, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So to some extent, to a golem, everything looks like a crisis. But eventually he finds something very much worthy of his time, because as this adventure is unfolding and the golem is like, who's trying to kill the Jews? Eventually someone shows him footage on her telephone of the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right, Tiki Torch, Jews will not replace us marchers, and is like, these guys, here you go. The golem's like, all right, great, now we're getting somewhere. And as luck would have it in the world of the book, a rally is scheduled to take place in a couple of days' time in a town called Wagner, Kentucky, which I made up. Kentucky is real. That is going to attract a similar cross-section of the extreme right. So the golem and his cohorts begin to make their way there. And ultimately, I think, for me, the moral dilemma at the heart of the book and at the heart of golem stories in general involves the proper moral use of this tremendous power. Len and his friend Miri ultimately are faced with a dilemma. They can do one of two things. They can allow the golem to run amok and slaughter hundreds of anti-Semites, in which case they might be safe, but also in which case, on some spiritual and basic level, they may no longer be Jewish. They may have sacrificed too much of the moral underpinnings, what is essential about Judaism, the values of the faith, in so doing, and have sort of sacrificed the thing they're trying to save. That's option one. Option two is that they erase that aleph and destroy the golem.
And folks are going to have to read the story to see what happens. No spoilers. No spoilers here. Let me ask you all a question. So many of these stories weren't written down originally. They were handed off. Almost person to person, right? These were oral stories that carry different messages. You both are also well steeped in the world of hip hop, which is also about verbal storytelling, right? The transmitting of knowledge and stories. But I'm curious, Adam, as you were researching, Langston, as you have researched, I'm curious, Langston, first, tell us about a story or urban legend or fable you wish everyone here knew and why. And Adam, I want to know specifically when we come to you, so I want to give you a little bit of time, right? What do you think you found most interesting? Your story moves through time. What do you think was most distinct about the story of the golem in the present day modern history versus the 1940s or Babylon? But first, Langston, I got to ask you, what's the story you wish all of us knew?
You know, it's actually a story that some people might know, but they might not know that it's a African-American folk story, and that's of Railroad Bill, who was a real person based on research. He was a man named Morris Slater, who was from the southeastern United States, maybe Alabama, maybe Tennessee, but he was well known in the early 20th century for robbing trains, essentially, right? But that's not why his story is powerful. It was, again, similar to Stagger Lee. You know, this was a figure who was robbing trains and got into these physical altercations with police and other people who tried to reprimand him. And he's a figure who lived outside of the law, right? And, you know, similar to Stagger Lee too, he was his tales ended up in our musical traditions, like blues. And I think even folk music, I think Dylan maybe even pulled from the Railroad Bill story as well. But I think it's just a great example of the Black storytelling tradition. A lot of these stories, especially in the 20th century, were based on real people. It's just through the storytelling tradition, their tales and their lives got embellished in very different kind of colorful ways, and later influenced, again, Black comedy, Black hip hop, and other things. But I've been researching Railroad Bill for a later book that I'm trying to write about how real figures become kind of folk figures, right, in a way. And he's a good example of that. And so, yeah, I would urge people to go out there and kind of listen to the Railroad Bill songs, maybe read the stories. There's a great book about him, and I can't think of the author's name, but yeah, he's someone I would put out there just as a really good composite representation of the Black storytelling tradition.
And Adam, just in case you forgot that question, talk to me a little bit about the golem in the modern era. How did it differ for you as you were writing compared to how he might show up in the 1940s or in the era of Babylon and enslavement there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I read a lot of the folklore of the golem, as well as some of the modern interpretations of the golem in researching the book, largely to make sure I wasn't doing something that had already been done. My conception of the golem is that he's sort of a figure who's in perpetual evolution. He's a being who is recalled into service at different moments, requiring different things of him. often in my book, he's recalled by people who are sort of trying to get him to do things that are not necessarily a part of his fundamental nature. He's most comfortable as a violent enforcer and defender and a goon. But over the course of time, we see him being recalled to do everything from study the holy books of the Jews in search of the secret name of God, because somebody gets it in their head that because he's a being created through the manipulation of language, much as God manipulated language to create the world, it will be through the golem that secret knowledge is acquired finally. The golem is like, is there maybe like a dam I could repair? You know, he wants no part of this. There's this sense in the book, you mentioned the 40s. In the book, the previous time the golem appears on the planet is in 1941 in Kiev, Ukraine, when he's riddled with machine gun bullets and cast into the Baban Yar Gorge, along with 33,000 other Jews who were murdered in a 36-hour period at that time, in the beginning of World War II, what we call now the Holocaust by bullets. And there's the intimation in the book that he's never made again, because the pace and the scale of death inherent to the Holocaust has in some way rendered him irrelevant. Like this guy who's been called again and again to protect Jewish folks kind of can't do it anymore. The world has outpaced him. And one of the first things he wants to know when he comes back, unaware of all this history, is why no one made him. And he's distraught about it. One thing that I found really interesting in doing the research, and that I think about a lot in terms of our current moment, is that if there's one commonality in all the stories of the golem, it is that he's never allowed to exist any longer than the absolute minimum possible amount of time to restore some semblance of peace. He's never allowed to go on existing as any kind of eternal vigilante or any kind of nuclear deterrent to anti-Semitism, because again, I think that would compromise our humanity too much. By the same token, no one ever makes an army of golems or a 1,000-foot golem. And it's not because there isn't enough clay in the world. I think it's because these stories are both about aggression and power, but also the danger of unchecked aggression and power, particularly unchecked aggression and power that we can't control, that we don't have the sophistication, the technology, the morality to fully be able to dominate and command. So in that sense, the golem also becomes not just like, you know, a figure out of revenge fantasy, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of power, the dangers of violence, the dangers of aggression.
Well, there's so many golems in modern literature, and they're just like Neil Shusterman, by the way. I don't know, does any of you know Neil Shusterman? He wrote this amazing trilogy called Scythe Trilogy. He writes in sci-fi genre. He does a lot of YA, but he has a book that he's just done recently, and it's actually a graphic novel about a golem being resurrected to help fight the Nazis, and sort of a fantasy story. And it's really interesting. And then there's also, by the way, Marge Piercy being a kind of an icon feminist writer who is just a brilliant writer. And her book, He, She, and It, did a fabulous job, I mean, of really telling the golem story in her way, with a woman actually playing an important role, by the way, which very rarely happens in any golem story, because it's not a feminist story. But so anyways, there's so much out there for people to read, and maybe we should share, people should think about that. But I guess, so I hear these themes. We're talking about tricksters and strongmen and wise asses, and in the African-American tradition. And I'm wondering, besides the golem, what else is there in the Jewish tradition? Is there, there's got to be more than the golem. And I'm wondering what are your thoughts?
I guess that's for me. Although Langston might be more qualified to answer than I am.
We could start with, we could talk about like whether, the Helm stories, whether there's, tell us whether humor has something to do with it. And also, and I know Eric has some ideas about this too. So, but Adam, do you have a thought?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if you receive like any kind of sort of conventional Jewish education in this country, which I should say I did not. I did not go to Hebrew school. I was not bar mitzvahed. I'm still a very elderly boy in the eyes of the Jewish world. But you could have that conventional education, or even a couple steps up from that, and never really be encouraged to engage very much at all with the folklore. And of course, there's a long history as to why that might be, that has to do with Jewish attempts to be to mainstream ourselves, to not be seen as different and other and outlandish and dangerous and all those things. And I think this happens with a lot of cultures. We sideline our own mythology, our own folklore, to our detriment ultimately.
Also, stories of like a lot of stories didn't make it into history or didn't make it into the books, like all the women's traditions. There's all those stories didn't make it into books. And also there was the whole idea of the Kabbalah and mysticism that was only for the super learned. So it wasn't available. So there's so many reasons why you're bringing this point is such an important point.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all of that. Of course, in the creation of any canon, there is the exclusion of many to the benefit of the few, and everything you just said is right on. So I say all that to say that, like, you might never find yourself engaging with the folklore or the folk wisdom of Judaism unless you do a pretty deep dive. And then you'll find creatures like the golem. Then you'll find Dybbuks and Ibbers, which to me are very funny because the Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit that takes over a human body. This is the Jewish version of possession. An Ibber is exactly the same thing, except that it's not a malevolent spirit. It's like, like a wise and benevolent spirit who takes over a human body, which is funny to me because, like, you could imagine that every Dibber thinks that it's an Ibber. You know what I mean? Like, but when I do think of when I think about Jewish sort of folklore and stories, I inevitably find myself thinking about jokes and anecdotes because that's, I think, what I grew up with. That's the more accessible and mainstream and conventional aspect of this body of knowledge, wisdom, literature that you're referring to. It's not so much focused on the supernatural. There are those beings, there are demons that are discussed quite extensively in the Talmud, for example. But yeah, my mind goes to these kind of miniature morality plays that employ humor very incisively to make important points that in some cases, may keep us alive or at least laughing.
Well,
Yeah.
we're gonna get to Eric in a second because I want to ask Eric the same question, but I just want to take a quick pause. Langston, I was curious, are there any golems in the African American tradition?
That's a great question that I have to think about a bit more. Go ahead.
About like tar babies. I'm not sure how politically correct it is to even use that. Anyways, I mean, I don't know. It sounded like a little bit of a golem that doesn't actually come to life, but I just didn't know, like, if there's somebody who comes in and saves people.
Yeah, there probably is. I have to think about that some more. I mean, there's certainly a wide body of African American folktales pulled from the Christian religion, right? In ways that, Moses, for example, there's many different stories about Moses. And of course, the story of Moses leading his people out of Egypt is, especially during antebellum slavery, is a story that Black people really pulled from. But outside of that, I have to think about that some more. That's a great question.
Mind, just pop in and interrupt us and tell us, because I've always been curious.
Yeah.
Right. I know you're asking questions, but I have to ask you a question. So, I also don't know about like Jewish animal stories. And I heard you mention that you had heard of one, and I'm so curious about that.
Yeah. So, were you asking me or Langston? I was gonna let Langston answer that.
Oh, I'm asking you right now.
I've been asking all kinds of questions. I was so excited when Langston and Adam agreed to join us, I started asking people all kinds of things. And lots of folks led me to stories I have not been able to put my hands on. So if someone can put their hands on that, I'd love to see it. So allegedly in medieval Jewish folk tales, there is a wise turtle, right? And the wise turtle is very much a trickster, very much like Brer Rabbit, right? Constantly finding ways of dealing with much larger kind of moments. And but I've come across like other talking animals as I was looking through their through some of those pieces. But one piece I have to say, right? I don't even know. Again, what's controversial? We don't know because we don't know each other's story and fables and where they sit in values and morality and controversy in these moments. But the one thing that really struck me was the story of Lilith, right? Also made out of clay, right? Uh, um, um, at least as I was reading one of the myths and fairy tales, right, gets in trouble for uttering the name of God, right, which is also one of the principles in making a golem. And so I started to see all of these pieces within there, talking animals, Leviathan being one of them, right? Vampires exist in some of the Jewish myths and fables. I read a story about a giant lion that I go back and dig up. But there were just these stories. But the piece that I found was I started to bond with folks as we were sharing stories kind of back and forth. So I made some new friends, right, as I was prepping for this, just from the power of sharing stories. But the one thing that I saw as a distinction is many Black folk tales are about escaping, right, particularly African American folk tales. The commonality that I saw between Black and Jewish folk tales was the entry of magic. And that was a question I wanted to about this escape. And it made me think of that, the people who can fly, Langston. And what is this kind of this lean into magic when we are telling stories and transmitting fables and myths? What is that about? And we see it both in Black and Jewish storytelling. Very dominant.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to answer this a couple of ways. One, I think, I have to also kind of highlight the importance of the hoodoo tradition or religion, sort of this kind of, I won't say hodgepodge of historic African religions that were kind of melded together in America during the slave trade. And so I think in some ways, some of that magic, right? Or this idea of magic comes from that tradition. And I'm thinking like High John the Conqueror came out of the hoodoo kind of tradition, and it's super big. I mean, it started in the southeastern United States and spread throughout the rest of the United States. But I think, magic, in some ways, it might be related to just the limits placed on us from slavery through Jim Crow on down to today, and us looking for any means of escape. And whether it be the Christian religion or the structure of the United States, none of these things ultimately were providing a source of escape from our subjugation. And so we can turn to magic, right? We can turn to otherworldliness, right, to provide that source of escape. And so, yeah, I think it's partly that, and also partly the continued presence of these historic and traditional African religions in America.
Well, magic is like so key to empowering people who feel disempowered. The whole magical folk tradition comes right from that. And from even like witches. There's just so much. There's so much there. And I'm wondering how this leads us to today, because obviously we need some magic to make our world a little better. It'd be nice to sprinkle it right now if we could. But
Yeah.
so the big question of today really is, well, how can we take these themes that are similar in African American culture and in Jewish culture, and we could dig so much deeper into both, really, and it could be a great long circuitous conversation to have, even more circuitous than this one. But I'm wondering, like, how can we use these to connect these communities that have so much in common in some ways? What I know, what are your thoughts?
So I'm gonna start. What I found is because stories carry so many common values around redemption, around safety. What does it mean to be community? Revenge, when stories of revenge when one is disempowered, right? Of fantasies, I should say, of revenge, not actuality. I thought actually many of the stories that I saw would really resonate across community. But it also then made me think a little bit about hip hop and the originations of hip hop. Maybe folks listening don't know, right? The diversity of hip hop, right? The Caribbean, Black Caribbean influence, the Black American influence, the Jewish American influence, the Puerto Rican Latin influence that was kind of fused. And in fact, folks began to kind of share stories in that way across hip hop in many ways, right? From in hard and good ways. And I'm curious, like, do we see that in hip hop today? Are stories shared cross culture? Is it conscious? Is it unconscious? What does it look? What does the transmission of stories look like? Because it's a street art that still exists today.
It's really a form of conversation that's so important. I mean, storytelling is a way to transcend. It is a way to transcend polarizing. Like, you telling stories is very different from like giving your opinion and, saying, well, this is what I think. And if you vote for so-and-so, you're an idiot. There's some way of telling stories which gets you maybe to some place that's useful and meaningful that we're forgetting. For all the talk about storytelling that goes on in our culture, it's very few people actually tell stories. I mean, yes, professional writers and professional musicians, but when was the last time, you sat at, there was somebody in your community that just sat down and was just telling stories that wasn't their like job, or you didn't pay to go $25 to go into a comedy club and hear somebody tell a story, or you didn't go into the, sign up for the Moth to tell your story. Like, I feel like we've lost that somehow. And if we could bring that back as a form of communication, as opposed, that would be amazing.
It would be interesting. I think about, and so I'll ask, we should ask Langston and Adam, why tell a story, and tell us how do you tell a story?
I think a lot of what is being said is right on the money and resonates very deeply with me. Beginning though with the idea that, particularly when I think about hip hop, the action of telling a story is about more than the content of the story. It's about the structure and the community that is inherent to that process, right? Telling a story is about the dynamic interplay between the teller and the listener, the storyteller and the audience. And those boundaries for the best stories become very blurry. And there's a community involvement, whether that takes the form of call and response, whether that comes in the form of laughter, whether that comes in the form of a gasp from a well-timed surprise. A lot of times we kind of edit the audience out of the storytelling. And I think that gets a little too far afield from the original purpose and context and meaning of stories. And I think about, in terms of the question of like Black and Jewish folks, the presentation itself is as important sometimes as powerful as the story. So when I think about just the physical spectacle of seamless mic passing, of collaborations between artists, fundamentally we're united in our shared humanity, and we're also united because we have the same challenges and the same enemies. A hallmark of anti-Semitism is the notion that Jews are involved in this nefarious conspiracy, and that we secretly control all aspects of life, from the media to the government and that kind of thing. And the great irony of American life is that your life is circumscribed by forces outside of your control. There are great conspiracies choking this country. The disappointing part from a narrative and a storytelling standpoint is that it's not through obscure machinations. These forces are actually very overt and tell you exactly what they're going to do. They're going to disenfranchise Black voters. They're going to outlaw abortion and contraception. They're going to roll back the rights of queer and trans people. They're going to prop up a dying corporate order in the name of the free market. They're going to infiltrate and militarize the police. They're going to restrict the rights of religious minorities. They're going to shoot up mosques and gay clubs and synagogues and Black churches and purge the government of non-believers and provoke a race war and establish a white ethno-state. That sounds like a giant conspiracy, but this is like a game plan. And, the face of anti-Semitism is the same as the face of anti-Blackness, right? The face of anti-Semitism isn't Kanye West, it's Richard Spencer, it's Donald Trump. And these people are not keeping it a secret. So I think the stories that we tell ourselves and tell each other ultimately circle back to what we share as groups who have been marginalized in different ways, using different stereotypes, right? Go right back to Shakespeare, right? You've got Shylock and Othello, right? These are not the same hateful stereotype. They're very unique and specific hateful stereotypes of the kind of brutish, Black, militaristic, emotion-driven man who can be undone by jealousy and his base emotions. And then Shylock, who is this Jewish figure who is obsessed only with with money and with the power that it can buy him, even at the expense of his own family. Like, these are blueprints for 500 years of European racism and anti-Semitism, and they stem from similar places and diverge, but they are inextricable from each other and connected to each other. And to dismantle one, you have to dismantle the other, and that's where stories come in.
That's great. Really thoughtful. I mean, conspiracy theories are stories too. They are stories that have been spun, negative stories that have been spun out of control through a whole bunch of things, like and really spun into our lives in part through social media. I mean, and technology, and they all have to work together to just really stand up to them or try to unravel them somehow. Or we've basically given up control of stories. Instead of communicating through stories, we now are there's these giant meta stories that are controlling us, which are scary. It's so true. Let's talk a second about hip hop too, how it all connects, because hip hop, which for everybody out there who might not know this, includes rap. it originated in the African American community, and it came out of these traditions. But boy, has it gone mainstream. And that, I mean, does it somehow have some kind of connecting tissue, something? Is there something there that we should be thinking about, or that we could learn from, or that?
I think there's a lot we can learn from it. And I was just thinking about Adam's response there and thinking about the power of story as a convener or convening, right? You know, my first hip hop community was in Austin, Texas in college, right? Where I would go to these underground hip hop shows. And, you know, though that audience, that community was super, super diverse. And it was about, you know, a variety of MCs getting on stage from a variety of backgrounds and races and cultures, telling their stories, right? And I learned a lot about other people. I learned a lot about myself personally, right? Just from being in that space with people who were sharing and telling their stories through the form of hip hop. And so I just wanted to suggest that in that way, like hip hop can unite us, right, through the practice of storytelling. Hip hop has gone very much mainstream, but you know, I would argue that it still maintains this kind of underground folk root. And in every single city around this world, you know, you'll find a hip hop community that's very local, very close, and very intimate in a way. And I think it's in those spaces where the true power and impact of hip hop continues to exist. So I want to put that out there too.
Yeah, if I could add to that, one thing I think we can model from hip hop or take from hip hop is the idea of a kind of intellectual democracy through collage. The way that hip hop works, particularly, you know, if you're of my generation, when people were sampling records, right? My generation of hip hoppers became students of and then experts of jazz and funk and rock and blues and reggae, because all of these things were being taken up and chopped up and reconfigured and pastiched through hip hop sampling practices. And the thing that was brilliant about it to me, when I talk about intellectual democracy through collage, what I mean is that no source was privileged because of where it came from. You didn't sample something or use something because it was cool. You used it because it was useful. And you used the part that was useful and you threw away the rest. And that could be a James Brown record, or it could be a Mickey Mouse Club record. It could be the Monkees, to name two famous hip hop drum breaks that have been widely sampled. And like the idea of taking that and applying it more broadly to the world and to thought has always been very appealing to me. The idea that we can look anywhere for inspiring, relevant, useful, helpful ideas, carve out what we need, dismiss the rest, not because we don't care about the context, but because we understand how to recontextualize and create something new from the scraps of the past, sonically, intellectually, emotionally. I feel like that's a really useful thing that we can learn from hip hop. Personally, for me, as a kid growing up in hip hop in the late 80s and early 90s, hip hop did much more than that. It gave me an entire political worldview. It made whiteness subjective for the first time. And, you know, people lament the passing of the era of hip hop sort of peak overt politicalness, the Public Enemy era. But as Langston said, these artists and these songs are still embedded in communities and still some of the most trenchant work being done and the most trenchant commentaries, whether it's on police brutality or the educational system in this country or anything else you could think to mount a critique of. You're going to find more astute observations in hip hop than you are probably in like the, you know, opinion section of the New York Times.
Yeah. There's an actual conversation going. And I see from Suzanne, she's telling us it's now 2:26. I don't know where the time went because I still got 8 other questions, maybe, and I can't ask them today. But what I am going to say first is, you know, for folks listening, one of the things I might say is one of the things you could do from this conversation is read more fables, tell more stories, right? Find 2 or 3 stories and tell them over and over. Hopefully find some that have meaning to you and that you think are important, but practice storytelling So our stories aren't being told, as Adam said, right, as Langston and Dean said, through the mouths and eyes of others, but we are telling our own stories, and we're telling them to the communities that matter most to one another. Adam, the Golem of Brooklyn. I just got to tell folks, read this story. Read the story. It's really beautiful, and we can't even get into it, but there's a story within a story within it that is very powerful in the open. And Langston's book, Welcome to Houston, Hip Hop Heritage in Hustletown. Get a hold of it. Follow these two. Find your own stories.
I feel like we actually had a really fun conversation and went places that we didn't plan, which is always the best.